Good afternoon, everyone. I think we're ready to kick off our next session. Thank you very much for joining us again. So this session is going to be talking around dynamic standards. And I'm Nick Monaghan-Dam. I'm from the services team at BSI. I'll be chairing the discussion today alongside the other people whose names you can see on the slide. And we'll introduce ourselves as we go through this over the next few minutes. So we're going to be talking about BSI's new approach, new flexible and dynamic approach, as the title suggests, towards standardization, towards developing standards. And this has a name, it's BSI Flex, so something that was recently launched over the last few months, but has actually been under development for quite some time. And we're going to talk about it today around a few examples, and in particularly how it can help to support both innovation around areas where markets are really quite dynamic and changing quickly, but also around requirements for greater resilience where markets need to adapt in response to an external shock or change. To do that, we've got a fantastic panel together with us today. So firstly, we have Catherine Hunter, and she's a key member of the project team that has been leading the development of BSI Flex and this approach towards a more flexible standardization. Secondly, Claire Price from our built environment team, who's deeply involved around one of the early examples of flexible standards, which is related to a competence framework in the built environment space. And thirdly, Nick Reed from Reed Mobility, and Nick has been instrumental in the development of the work that we're doing around connected and automated vehicles, and particularly an online vocabulary that has already been through several iterations, and we'll come back in a minute and hear about that. Just to say, as we go through the session today, we would very much welcome your questions. We will have a kind of main part of this, which will be a panel. So we'll just have a quick introduction presentation in a minute, but mostly it'll be an opportunity for us to ask some questions, for me to ask some questions of our panelists, but we hope to get some questions directly from you. So please do think as we're going through and add things into the Q&A, and hopefully we'll be able to pick up most of those later on. And then to get us started, Catherine is going to provide us with a bit of background about BSI Flex, how it came about, and how it complements the other existing routes to standardization that we have at BSI. So Catherine, if you're able to do so, it'd be great if you can go ahead and present your slides, please.
Thanks for the introduction, Nick. Just a bit more about the context within which we decided to develop this new type of standard. Nick has spoken a little bit about the need to be dynamic in the way that we deliver standards. If we look at what's happening in industry, we've got increasing pace of innovation, increasing pace of adoption of new technology, digital disruption, and also other sources of disruption, for example, global pandemics. And so everyone is experiencing change, rapid change, and it is continuous change as well. Today's best practice can be out of date tomorrow. Technologies move on, new methodologies emerge at speed. Standards are still really important to build confidence and also to ensure high quality outcomes, but we're working in a very different set of circumstances within some industries than we're used to due to that speed of change. We did some research a couple of years ago to really understand if what we were doing was catering for those more fast-moving industries. And whilst what we do with British Standards and PASs is absolutely critical, where there is a good degree of stability and a good degree of consensus around good practice and mature understanding around good practice, it was clear that we weren't really catering for sectors or disciplines experiencing rapid and continuous change. So our challenge really was to create standards that are flexible, that can adapt to that change, provide the latest and best point of reference. And at the heart of that is to build consensus around that best practice as well. Our research showed very clearly that whilst there was a need for us sometimes to work differently, we still needed to retain some of the core principles that our standards are known for, particularly around consensus. So just moving on to the next slide. Nick's mentioned BSI Flex standards, which is a new type of standards. Just to cover a few key points about what's a little bit different about this type of standard compared to other standards that you'll be more familiar with. Flexibility around the scope. And this is, I guess, in a couple of ways we needed to build in additional flexibility. When we start developing a standard, the scope of that standard may need to change, and that can be quite difficult to do under processes to develop a British standard or a PAS. We've designed BSI Flex to really allow for that change. It's not always going to be clear at the outset what needs to be included within the scope. So actually designing something that allows for changes was a bit different and something that we felt we needed to do. Also, the other thing in terms of the flexibility around scope is also in the duration of the project itself. So sometimes we may not be clear how long we might need to run a particular project for, and that will become clear when I start to talk about the frequent iterations and the frequent versions that we produce when we develop a BSI Flex. So it's not starting out with a fixed idea of what a project might look like in terms of process can be very helpful when you don't actually know what might happen within the industry and what the requirements are that you might be needing to standardize. The second key feature is rapid iteration. So the ability to dynamically update content as things change and to rapidly release new versions. Another key point around this is the ability to actually get something out very quickly, an initial version out quickly. So really accelerating the point at which end users can derive value from the thinking of the experts that have pulled together the content. Responsive evolution. So another key component of Flex is being very sensitive to how the standard is being used within the industry. So every time we produce a version, what we're very keen to do is very closely track how it is being used and invite comments at all times on the content. So we understand we're taking a temperature check constantly on how this standard is being used. So we are in a position to respond and change the content as necessary. And then finally, open consultation. In common with all the standards we develop, providing people with the opportunity to comment and for everyone having their say is at the core of this process as well. So moving on, just to show you a bit more about how we differentiate BSI Flex from other standards. Before I do that, features in common. So on the left-hand side, you will recognise these as being key features of all the standards we produce that I've put on the slide. And just to say, this isn't an exhaustive list of all outputs that might come from a technical committee, for example. We've focused on British standards, but you will know that there are other outputs as well, such as PDs and DDs, but we've focused on these three for simplicity, really. On the left-hand side, the things that you will know well about defining characteristics of standards: balanced and broadly representative stakeholder groups, consensus, I've already mentioned, subject to unrestricted open consultation and periodic review. So Flex has that in common with PASs and British standards. What is different is the circumstances within which we might use a Flex. So on the right-hand side, you can see we have these part of the diagram around certainty. And we know that British standards are an extremely good option where there is certainty within a particular industry or certainty around a particular methodology. They provide stability, longevity, confidence that things aren't necessarily going to change dramatically. They allow people to invest in systems and processes to implement those standards. So they work very well where there is established practice. If you come to the other end of the scale, where we talk about low levels of certainty in areas of emerging practice, this is the gap that we're filling with BSI Flex. So it's that ability to adapt and to change in areas where there is still a huge degree of uncertainty. Just moving on to the next slide, just a little bit more detail on how this actually works in practice. In common with PASs and British standards, we have governance around this process of development. We have Flex Zero in the way that we have PAS Zero and BS Zero. The advisory group is a key group of experts who we bring together. They provide the decision making on the technical content in a way that you would be very familiar with from working on British standards and PASs and European international standards. The key difference here is that we would be monitoring how the scope of the standard may be changing and actively making sure that we are bringing the right people in within quite condensed timescales with each version that we produce to make sure that we are getting a representative stakeholder group that is responding to the changes that are happening in the marketplace. So we would fully expect the advisory group to change quite significantly between versions and to expand. The advisory group, the intention was always for them to work virtually. Obviously, this year has meant we're doing everything virtually, but the intention was always that we made the best use of the advisory group's time in terms of the efficiency. We know that working on standards is time consuming, and it is something that people fit in, you know, against a very busy backdrop of other commitments. And so by trying to move to work virtually with this, because we are asking people to work at pace, you know, the advisory group, and you will hear from some of the examples that the timescales within which they've been working. So we need to make it easy for people to participate in this process. So the intention was always for the meetings to be virtual, but actually a lot of the tools that we've been experimenting with have helped us support online collaborative authoring, for example, which is a slightly different way of working. So we've spent quite a bit of time understanding how the use of those tools might change the dynamic in terms of consensus building, and how those tools have to make sure, how we have to make sure in using those tools that we're not, you know, presenting any barriers for people getting involved. So that's been quite an interesting process. The process itself, you can see as a sort of cycle. At the end of each cycle, we're effectively producing a new version of the BSI Flex. Just to very quickly run through this, the advisory group would review the initial draft. We would encourage them, in the interests of speed and knowing that there will be a future version for them to consider, to leave out sections where they feel they are not able to reach consensus. We're trying to be flexible here, and we're trying to work within tight timescales, and actually knowing that you can come back and look at a section potentially within a few months for the next version is intended to encourage the advisory group to reach rapid agreement on those bits they can agree, but to park those components that they might need to come back to on the second version. Once they've reached agreement, the content is updated and signed off by the advisory group and BSI, and the first version is published. And there are a number of different ways in which we could provide that content depending on how it's going to be used. And one of the examples we'll talk about, the vocabulary we provided in a slightly different way, because we realized people wanted to use that content in a slightly different way. Now, that first version, the point at which it is released for use, it is also released for public consultation. And it is the period of that public consultation is not a fixed period. It is highly dependent on how long we think and how long the advisory group would like us to leave that out for comment. What we would like to try and do is align these periods of consultation as much as possible with other things that are happening, for example, test beds or pilots, to ensure that the content is actively being used and tested within certain environments. So hence the reason for not having a fixed timescale around that. We want to be adaptable, and we want to respond to what's actually happening within the industry. The comments are collected from that open consultation, again, coming back to the advisory group for review and agreement, reaching consensus on the next version, which is then produced. Now, we could continue going round in that cycle for as long as is necessary. And one of the great things here is that we are constantly looking at the level of comments and the nature of the comments that are coming in on each version. And that helps us work with the advisory group to inform the decision about what we do next. And what we may find is things start to settle down. We start to see more stability, and it starts to look like it may be more sensible to actually progress this as something else. And one of the examples that I'll talk about in a minute has actually gone forward to provide the basis for a piece of work with an ISO. So we would fully expect any BSI Flexes that we develop to complement the work programme, both in the UK and internationally, and to provide a sort of early stage iterative process and content that can then be taken forward as a different type of standard in future. So just an example, and there was a session on this piece of guidance yesterday, which provided really good in-depth look at the content. Just to explain, this was one of the pilot projects that we tried out on the first couple of versions of this, and then the third version actually was published as a BSI Flex. We were asked to provide help for organisations in identifying and managing risks associated with COVID-19 was when in a range of workplaces. This was developed at pace. The first version was actually published within a month of the project being initiated, and that is pretty tight timescales when you consider what needs to be done. And it was a fantastic effort by the advisory group and the team at BSI to actually get that first version out there. And then another 2 versions in the couple of months that followed. It's now being used as the basis of a seed document for some work within ISO. Now, just to explain, obviously everyone is aware of the circumstances surrounding the pandemic, but it's a really good example of where this approach, this flexible approach, was incredibly helpful, because the advice from the UK government and globally was changing, and it was changing very quickly. And had we tried to develop a standard, either a PAS or a British standard, the timescales simply weren't going to work for the rapid change that we were seeing in the guidance from government. So it's a really nice example of a major disruptor potentially bringing about significant changes in direction with regards to the advice that people should be following. So it was a really nice one to use as an example, an early example of BSI Flex. So just to summarise where we think BSI Flex standards help, and at this point I just also want to say that, as with any standard we develop, we would develop a Flex standard where there is a gap, where there is a need for a new standard. We would make sure it doesn't overlap or conflict with any other standards. It is meant to complement other work within the work programme, but to offer a solution very specifically in those areas that are experiencing rapid change. And in those circumstances, they can provide an up-to-date reference point, which can then lead to greater resilience, because we are able to provide adaptable good practice which changes with the circumstances with which our standards users are experiencing. And critically, a really good way to provide support for innovation within industries, standards that move at the same pace as innovation. This was some feedback that we received quite early on in this project, the feedback from innovators that standards didn't keep pace. And so that's exactly what we're aiming to do with this new development. And then finally, our ability to achieve a faster time to market for what could be seen as an MVP version of good practice, which is available for use, but also available for further development. So that's as much as I wanted to cover in the introduction. So I'm going to hand back to Nick.
That's great. Thank you very much, Catherine. That's brilliant. That's a really useful introduction to Flex, kind of how it works in terms of the process and relates to the other routes towards standardization. And we can pick up questions that you have on that as we go through. I've seen some questions coming through in the Q&A, which is fantastic. Thank you, that we can pick up in a minute. But as we're going, just keep on firing them through so that we can be thinking ahead to those and hopefully covering those off in a minute. So we are going to move forward towards the panel, but the way we're going to do it is I'm going to ask each of the 2 panelists who haven't spoken yet to just talk a little bit about what they've been doing, and then we'll have a chat together and pick on some of your questions too. And the focus is going to be around some practical applications where this flexible approach is being used, where we've been kind of trying it out and working the best way to do it in response to some, I think, pretty clear industry requirements. So Catherine's already touched on one with the safe working guidelines, and as she said, that was covered in more depth yesterday, and I think there'll be a recording if you missed that you can go and find out more on that. So we'll talk particularly more around 2 others, and so those are going to come, as I mentioned before, around connected and automated vehicles and around something looking at competency frameworks for the built environment. So if we start with the first one of those, if I can ask Nick Reed from Reed Mobility just to talk for a few minutes around the work he's been doing developing a vocabulary for connected and automated vehicles. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks very much, Nick, and thanks to BSI for inviting me to talk on this topic. So, yeah, Reed Mobility is an independent consultancy working at the forefront of future transportation. And one of the main topics that occupies my time is connected and automated vehicles, as Nick has said, or CAVs, as they're known. Led trials on this topic over many years. And we all anticipate that there are some big potential benefits to the transportation system. Safer roads, greater efficiency, more accessible transport system. So there's a lot of momentum behind the development of the technology. But with that, there's a lot of inconsistency and misuse of language around the terms related to CAVs. So I think BSI were keen to set a foundation so that we're all talking the same language. So yeah, I was recruited to be the technical author of that vocabulary. And for that to be a trial of the new Flex process, in the belief that the more traditional approaches weren't quite right in this situation, where the technology is emerging, where the definitions are evolving over time. That greater flexibility of the new approach seemed very appropriate in this instance. And I think what I'd be keen to reflect is how the process doesn't sacrifice the rigor and industry oversight and the public consultation elements in achieving that flexibility and pace. And I think testament to that is that it wasn't delayed by the pandemic, as Catherine had described. A lot of the ways of working that were established in developing the Flex process are resilient to that kind of disruption. And so from the first meeting about the development of the vocabulary to the first published version of the vocabulary took 4 months. And we're now on our third iteration. It's grown to over 60 terms. And the definitions are starting to stabilize now as we go around the process with more and more stakeholders, with more and more public consultation. We're getting to a kind of mature product, I think, that is really gaining traction in industry. And I think it's a really good fit for this type of work, and especially in industries where the technological developments run at a faster clock speed than is perhaps appropriate for more traditional methods of standardization. And so, you know, in a kind of uncertain world, it's a really great approach for BSI to be adopting. And yeah, looking forward to answering any questions you might have about how it's been possible for us to work through this Flex standard.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Nick. And as I said, we'll come back to that and look at it in a bit more detail in a second. Claire, would you like to go ahead and talk to us about the work you've been doing around the development of a competence framework for the built environment, please?
Sure. Thank you, Nick. Yes, I'm Claire Price. I'm the sector lead in the built environment team at BSI. I'm also a project lead in a new work programme looking at built environment competence standards, or BECS standards. It's a major work programme. It was launched in the spring to develop standards, helping to raise the competence of individuals working in the built environment. The programme itself is being sponsored by MHCLG. It's designed to support the new building safety regulatory regime following the Grenfell disaster and Dame Judith Hackett's review of the industry. The programme itself is taking place over 2 years in 2 phases, and ultimately will be delivering in spring 2022. We're developing an overarching framework for competence that will be delivered ultimately as a British standard, a BS standard, and we're delivering 3 PAS documents focusing on the competence for the 3 newly regulated roles under the new regulatory regime of the principal designer, principal contractor, and the building safety manager. And that work will start next year. So the programme's part of a major rollout of changes for the industry, and the overarching framework will establish some core competencies that'll need to be followed across the whole supply chain, across the whole of the industry. And anyone defining, anyone evaluating, anyone certifying, and most importantly, perhaps anyone having to demonstrate competence are going to be impacted by the new framework. So quite early on, when we were working out how the programme was going to look and how it was going to be delivered, it was pretty quickly identified that a flex process would be really useful for that overarching framework standard. And that's really for two reasons, I think. I mean, we do need to respond quickly. You know, the industry is already working hard. There's already a lot of people who feel like the process post-Grenfell is taking an awfully long time, and you know, how long is it going to be before we see all the improvements that are so badly needed? So there was a need to move quickly, but industry is also, you know, working hard out there. They're developing their own competence frameworks. So our framework itself is going to be an overarching framework. All of the activity in industry is going to map against that work. So we really also needed to provide that leadership and ensure that coordinated approach, so that we were providing the leadership needed. I think the second reason, and perhaps more importantly, is that the change itself, the proposed changes for the industry, is really significant. You know, and it's having a huge impact. It will have a huge impact right across the board, as I've said, across all the sectors and all the subsectors. So achieving consensus is expected to be really, really quite challenging. And a multi-iterative approach was felt to be a really good one. That would help us to sort of get it right and continue the work to ensure that we were getting the consensus that we needed, and to allow industry to start mapping against the framework as quickly as possible. So I guess something else to say quickly is that the new framework work started in, I think, June. And we delivered the first iteration in September, so we're quite at the beginning of the process on the BEX work programme. And I think perhaps that's enough to say from me. We can move over to questions.
That's great, fantastic. Thank you, Claire. If everyone could put their cameras and audio, or audio if there isn't too much background noise, we'll start to move into some questions. I've seen some good ones coming through in the Q&A actually, so we might move on to those quite quickly, but please keep them coming. They're great, they're very helpful. We'll try and answer them, and they're also really useful for us to inform our thinking going forward. You know, that's very much the approach here, that it's something that can grow in line with the market requirements. I think hopefully we've talked reasonably well around some of the the market driver for this, but I mean, if I just say, which I sort of touched on the beginning, I think hopefully what's come across in what Catherine, Claire and Nick have started to talk about is there's a bit of a mix of, as I say it at least, two different types of requirement. So one is around a need to respond to innovation or to fast moving market spaces where they want the standard to keep up. It's not just a question of speed, it is, as Catherine said, around flexibility, that need to iterate. So it is a kind of or consistent within MVP type approach. And then so that's a good context for the kind of thing that Nick Reed was talking about with connected and automated vehicles, where it's clearly a fast moving space and a lot going on. Whereas the other examples that Catherine initially with the safe working guidelines, and then Claire in a bit more detail talked about, were more sort of a response to an external shock or change or something in the market that's happened, and the industry needs to respond to it, but quickly and flexibly. So that's just an observation, but I wonder if anyone from the panel would like to add to that. I don't know, Nick, if you want to comment on that further, just around the nature of the sort of the CAV space and why you think this approach was needed for connected and automated vehicles.
Yeah, I think there's kind of the external need for automated vehicles in terms of safety and efficiency of the transport system. But also that the technology developers aren't hanging around. You know, they're developing this technology very quickly, driven by venture capital funding or by market drivers for the technology. So clearly there's a need, there's a market drive, but that means there's an important kind of regulatory role that needs to be there to ensure that the technologies that are developed don't place undue risk on passengers or users of those vehicles or those who are encountering those vehicles on the road. So the ability to generate this type of guideline, this flex standard quickly to help align the industry around the terminology, at least, was a really important step, I think, because certainly I'm sure the audience will be aware there are those who perhaps intentionally misuse some of the language around automation of vehicles, and I think it's really important to have a kind of a source of truth, ground truth on what the terms mean when we're thinking about automation of road vehicles, because it's at the end of the day it's an environment that is safety critical, and too many people lose their lives on the roads as it is. It would be a shame if technologies being introduced in the pursuit of safety result in fatalities because of misunderstandings around the language, which is a genuine risk.
And Nick, would it be fair to say, to sort of follow up, that part of the reason why a more flexible approach was required was the fact that language wasn't quite kind of certain at the beginning, and there was a sense that it needed to go through a set of iterations, or at least quite a lot of to and fro with industry to try and work out what the best way to articulate or describe each of those key terms would be? Absolutely,
yeah. So that I mean, sometimes people use similar terms in different ways, not through for nefarious reasons, just because that's their practice or their habits. And I think it was really helpful for organizations that have those differing views to be around the same table and to sort of hammer out which was going to be the agreed definition, and making sure that everyone's perspective was taken into account. And I really wouldn't underplay the role of public consultation in the process, because of that need for transparency and building that trust and assurance around what the industry is doing, and giving members of the public confidence that when these technologies are being described, they can see exactly what's being talked about and the implications of that technology.
Thank you, Nick. And I wonder, Claire, is there anything else that you wanted to add?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think, I mean, the common element to both innovation and these sort of shock events are the need to take people with you. It's really important to ensure that you're taking people with you, and actually having multiple public consultations and really inviting those comments and really getting that engagement is really very important in both those areas. I mean, our first iteration had over 770 comments, so and we don't expect those people to go away. I think they're going to be sort of feeding into the process, as we go forward as well. So I think that's another element that's really important about it.
Thank you. So the extra iterations allow time for those comments to be kind of worked through and reflected in the next versions.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Catherine, was there anything else you wanted to add to that?
Not particularly on that point, but I'm just conscious of a couple of questions that I could pick off, if that's okay, that I've seen come in on the chat around versions, which is really interesting. And this was one of the big challenges we had. So a couple of people have commented, version control is very important. Chance that frequent revisions could create confusion. And absolutely, we were very aware that we needed to be very clear when we released each version that it was going to be likely to change. So that's a different communication challenge for us than we would have with other standards. So we did put quite a lot of thought into that. We've we hope we've signposted very clearly which is the current version. We are also hoping to provide, where possible, visibility of what has changed between versions. Each version has a unique identifier. So yeah, very, very conscious of that. We do not want to confuse, and we do not want people to end up using the out-of-date version. So that has been something that we put an awful lot of thought into. Yeah.
And maybe a follow-up to that, because I think I saw some sort of related questions in there, and I know it's something that we've touched on when we've been talking to people externally, Catherine, around the amount of time between those versions, and if they seem to be too frequent, for example, is that difficult for the market to absorb those? Certainly, I'm certainly not a technologist by background, but having worked with lots of organisations in tech type arenas or areas of change, we've seen a bit of a balancing act where I've heard people saying, we want it to be able to adapt and change when we need it, but if it changes all the time, it's really difficult. It's a bit like if software changes all the time, we have to change all of our systems and all our processes. So I wonder if you comment on that, Catherine.
Yeah, sure. And I think this is the beauty of this process, is that we haven't given fixed timescales for when the next version of a Flex should be produced, because we want to be able to respond and get that balance right. Hence the need to really closely monitor the feedback and the usage to understand when we get to a critical mass of change which is sufficient to trigger the next version, to be able to discuss that with the advisory group, and not to just go through the process of creating a new version because it's 3 months after the last version, because that's change that's not driven by the industry needs. So every step of the way we're trying to be very responsive to when we see the signals that another version is needed, not just because it's 3 months after the last one or similar. So it's a very important part of this process.
And Nick, just to follow up on that as well, the iteration of the versions, it's not necessarily only about the content. It can be about the presentation of the standard. So some of the feedback, and indeed one of the questions, relates to categorization of terms within the CAV vocabulary. So in between the second and third version, we're able to add categories. So if an organization or an individual is only interested in terms related to sensors, they can now pick out the list of terms that are within that category. So yeah, it gives that flexibility to be able to present the information in different ways according to the industry need.
Thank you, Nick. And actually, as you went on to that, if you can just talk maybe a bit about that for the CAV vocab, because I think one of the things that's interesting is that it is, it's online, and we've kind of adapted how that's shown. I don't know if you have any further comment on that.
No, that's right. So at first it was PDF and online, just as a simple list, and that's evolved over time to add this categorization function as well, and to include, I think, as Catherine referred to, the items showing where items have changed from one version to the next. So where there's been an update between version 2 and version 3, you can still see what the version 2 definition was and see how that's changed in version 3, just so that organizations can understand where those changes have been applied, and can engage with BSI on reasons for that, if that's of interest.
Thank you, Nick. I'll pick it up maybe because it's sort of related. So there's a question around needing to point to aspects of existing standards. I wonder, Catherine, if you want to pick that up overall, because it's a common challenge in standardization that there's an awful lot that exists already and needing to link to other areas. And then maybe we can go back to either Nick or Claire if they have any specific comments. But Catherine, do you have an overall comment?
Yes, I didn't see that comment actually, but I'm assuming this is to make sure that we're developing a Flex so that it corresponds with standards that are relevant and could potentially pick up potential problems with other standards that are in the portfolio. I think this is common to all of our standardization work. I don't think Flex is unique in this respect. With any standard that we develop, we would be conscious of receiving feedback that was perhaps pointing to an update needed in other standards. So absolutely, this is intended to be developed as part of the wider portfolio, and those linkages between standards are absolutely critical. And the sort of being able to use those standards as a whole to solve a problem, not just as an individual piece of content, is really important. So wherever we would pick up potential things that need to be changed in other standards, we'd be feeding that back to the relevant technical committee, of course.
Thank you for that. Thank you. Sorry, Claire, did you want to add anything on that?
Well, I think mainly around this need for stability, and I think it is really important, and what we are working towards ultimately, and the decision was taken right at the beginning, is although we're using the Flex process, we ultimately want to be delivering a British standard because we're looking for that stability. But what we're trying to do is to balance that need for stability against what's happening out in the world. And what's happening is that there's new regulations, a new bill, new secondary legislation coming, activity that industry is undertaking as well. So we're just trying to sort of balance that so that we're able to respond to that over a period of time, but ultimately to get to that stable position.
That was actually perfect, Claire, because that was going to be my next question. It was one of the questions we've been thinking that would be interesting to cover, but I think I saw it coming up in the chat around, you know, the potential evolution of a Flex to something else. So if we maybe start with the potential evolution to a British standard, because that's what's happening in this case, isn't it, Claire? And if there's anything further that you'd add to that, and maybe if you have any comments about how the iterations or versions of Flex might be used in the interim before it becomes a British standard.
Yes, I mean the document that we're developing is an overarching framework, and we know that there's a lot of activity out there with people developing sector and subsector frameworks, and they all need to map against this new framework. And in fact, we ourselves are producing the 3 PAS documents for these 3 newly regulated roles. So as we start work on those next year, we need to be mapping those against this Flex. So it needs to work both ways, really, which is why it's so useful to have the Flex and that agile approach. In terms of it becoming a British standard, I'm not quite sure that it's that there's any real issue with that ultimate goal of what the document becomes, actually. And I'm sure, you know, I'd be interested in Catherine's view if she thinks there is you know.
No, I think this is it's having these different methods of developing standards that complement each other. And we for a long time, you know, we have got great track record of developing a PAS in an area where there isn't necessarily a technical committee, that then is taken forward as a seed document by that technical committee as an ISO, for example. And I think we would see the same thing happening with Flex. I think it's a natural progression. And I think the key thing here is that it does allow, particularly if it's has a UK stakeholder group, it allows that stakeholder group to get an early line in the sand, an early sort of, you know, view of what good practice looks like that could then potentially be taken forward internationally, which is really really powerful. So I think absolutely this is all about you know, potentially transferring the Flex into something else more suitable as the area matures. Absolutely.
But also, I guess, you know, thinking about, to deliver a British standard, you need to have a formally constituted technical committee. So there's a whole heap of things that need to be put in place. So this is all happening while you're building up that basis. So.
Yeah.
That's actually quite a useful segue into a question really around who's involved and how that changes over time. I wonder maybe if Catherine could start on that and then come back to Nick and Claire, and how that maybe is different. I know you sort of touched on it on your slides, Catherine, but if you could just talk about that a bit, please.
Yeah, so the advisory group is the key decision-making group, as I mentioned. We have similar methods in terms of making sure that is representative. You know, these are consensus-based documents, so we have to make sure that we feel this is a representative group to make decisions on the technical content. So we are, as for all of our standards activities, reliant on the experts working in these fields to join these groups and you know, join the decision-making process and help to develop the content. And then more broadly, yes, at the point at which we would go out for that open consultation, we would have proactively built a network of people who we really specifically want to target to respond, because we know they will have an interest, but that is ultimately open to absolutely everybody to respond to as well. So in terms of the people involved, it's very similar groups, similar representation. You know, as we would do for any standards, we'd be conscious of making sure that we have consumer input where we need it. Absolutely. So it is very similar. I think what is different is that group itself is probably fairly dynamic depending on the direction that the standard takes. And actually, with some of these areas, because we are potentially working in areas where there are no current standards, they are also potentially people who are entirely new to standards development themselves. So that can create a slightly different dynamic, which is interesting as well, and good. So yeah.
Might come back to that point in a minute, actually, if that's right, Catherine. But I just wondered, Nick, if you also had any thoughts on that, because obviously the CAB vocabulary is now into its third iteration, and any thoughts in terms of how that's kind of evolved over time in terms of the advisory group, or even how it might in future?
Yeah, sure. So when I think back to how the iterations have developed, I sort of see the first iteration as probably being about 60% complete, and then the second iteration about 80%, and then the third iteration now I think we're probably at 90% complete. So there's a kind of asymptote and stabilization of the terms and definitions, and some of that emerges because of the breadth of input that you get over time with the different consultations. And I've been really interested to see who has responded to the public consultation. So we've had great industry support from the advisory group, which has been a constant, more or less a constant within the in the process. Not that it needs to be, but that's just the way it has been. But from the public, on the public side, organisations that have been represented through that public consultation have really made a difference and really influenced our thinking about what terms should be included and how they should be defined. And we can now think about including those organisations that were represented in the public consultation into the advisory group going forward. And maybe others that have been there from the start actually feel quite comfortable with where they are and are happy to drop out. So yeah, I think that sort of dynamism in the advisory group and the variety of inputs that you can get through the consultation process have really strengthened the output, the standard that's emerged.
Thank you. And actually, you were making an interesting kind of related comment, about the evolution of the group of people and getting their input, but also the evolution of the different versions themselves. That, I mean, maybe not surprisingly, there's quite a lot of change at the beginning, and then it kind of reaches an asymptote, or reaches a degree of stability, which I think sort of touches on what Claire and Catherine were talking about before around how it might evolve. Yes. Either it just stabilizes as a flex, or if appropriate, it evolves into something else.
Yeah, I think the terms and definitions have stabilized nicely. I don't think the industry has stabilized to an extent where you would consider progressing to a different type of standard. So I think that the flex approach does give that kind of flexibility, exactly as it's defined, to reflect the changes in the industry.
That's great, thank you. I wonder, just to make sure I don't forget it, because you raised an interesting point, Catherine, around kind of embracing and engaging, which is an overall constant goal, isn't it, at BSI? Broader groups of people, making it easier for people to get involved in different ways in the sort of the standards creation process. And I just wondered if you had any further comments on that, Catherine.
Well, I think, and actually this sort of one comment has come in actually, which is related to this, I think related to my answer, which is why can't all standards be created in this way? And I think there is a lot we have learnt. I mean, to be honest, across the board, all of the standards development work we've doing has gone virtual overnight because of the pandemic. And it's a huge achievement from our committee members and team at BSI that has been achieved. I think in terms of engaging people going forward and encouraging more people to join in, both through what we've learned on Flex and the tools that we've used to develop BSI Flex, and through what as a business, as an organisation, we've had to do as a result of the pandemic, we have learned a huge amount about how people can efficiently engage with our process, and I think that is one of the key things for me, is making sure that however we innovate and the tools that we use, they must be an enabler. They cannot create a barrier to people getting involved, and hopefully make it easier for people to get involved in a time efficient way. Because it's important that as we start to standardize in new areas, we're able to offer a very robust way of people getting involved, and invite them in, and ensure that they feel they can make a good contribution. Nothing else to add on that, really.
No, thank you. And I wonder, sort of a related point, Nick, if it feels like a logical point to pick it up, if there are any associated challenges with that. We're trying new things in slightly different ways, intentionally so. If you just had any comments on any issues and how we're starting to overcome them, or is beginning to look at them.
Yeah, I mean, there were some technical hiccups to begin with. I think that for BSI to enable external access into documents that are securely held within BSI, and allow editing of those documents, it wasn't a trivial challenge to overcome. But once that process had been sorted out, things progressed very quickly. I think the other challenge that we have is something that we've alluded to already, and that is is the market aware of the changes and updates to the Flex standards as they evolve? And I think that places the onus on BSI to engage and communicate successfully with the market and share that those updates are taking place. And I think it just builds that conversation that ensures everyone is on the same page. And so yeah, I think provided BSI can build those relationships and maintain that engagement with the industry, depending on whichever industry it is, there's every, I can only see benefit to this process.
Thank you. And Catherine, I don't know if you want to add anything further on that.
Yeah, just one final comment from me on the tools and the digital transformation piece. So what we've learned on Flex and the tools that we've used on Flex, there is this is not unique to Flex. And what we would hope to do, and this is part of a much bigger digital transformation program, is to start to use these tools across the breadth of the standards work that we're doing. So whilst we're trying some new approaches with BSI Flex, we would hope that we can transfer those learnings across the board, really.
Thank you. I'm conscious that we're. Oh, sorry, Claire, do you want to chip in, and they're going to move towards final questions?
Oh, right,
yeah.
Okay.
No, you go ahead.
Chip in on that. Yeah, I mean, I think that the system of the review panel system, which applies in both PASs and the Flex, which is like, we've got over 800 people on a review panel, which means they've been kept informed every time an iteration is issued, every time there's a public consultation, which is just really good. But the speed, in terms of challenges, I think one of the speed things is people are still playing catch up. We are still being approached by people saying, I'd like to get involved, and we're already at the first iteration. And so it's just managing that, really, that sheer weight of interest, and making sure that people are kept informed as much as possible, really.
Yeah, I think it's a sort of challenge that we're inviting and bringing on ourselves, isn't it? But that's what we need to do. We do need to start wrapping up. So just if you have any quick final observations, each of you, in terms of maybe sort of related areas where Flex might be suitable. I don't know, Nick, if you have anything really quickly on CAB, any related areas you think might be interesting.
Yeah, so BSI has been doing a piece of work on a standards roadmap for CAB, so identifying the white space, and there's certainly some potential areas in there where Flex might be more appropriate for developing standards. I think one of the interesting ones for me is certainly for UK drivers, and I'm sure there's similar documents in countries around the world, the highway code, which specifies how drivers should behave. I think something very different might have to emerge for automated vehicles, which may only operate in certain environments, may have very different behaviors and need to obey very different rules. Certainly where there are non-safety critical behaviors that need to be standardized. I can imagine the Flex process working very well to develop a best practice around CAV driving behaviours.
Thank you very much. And Claire, any quick reflections?
Well, I think probably, yeah, certainly around the innovation piece, really. You know, there's been so much done in the built environment industry recently, not least the Construction Innovation Hub, but a whole heap of funded activities around innovation, and especially on the modern methods of construction, off-site construction platform approach, whatever term you want to use. And I think that as that starts to roll out, as all those findings and all that research output is needed, how that gets diffused across the industry, I think this would be a great way of doing that, and actually sort of testing those new methods.
Thank you, Glenn. And Catherine, any final thoughts?
Very quick final thought. Dynamic vocabularies in areas of innovation. You know, we've seen how it's worked so well with CAV, and I think that is an area that we can help enormously.
Brilliant, thank you all. And I would add, you know, anything when there are big innovation programs or where there are, as Catherine touched on earlier, test beds and trials going on in parallel, I think the more we can link those up, the better. I think that's a really exciting area for us to continue to explore. We are running out of time. We've tried to, thank you for all of your questions. We've tried to cover the majority of those. I'm sure there are a couple we haven't managed to. We've got a stand in the knowledge work marketplace if you want to come and have a chat to us tomorrow, but otherwise I'm sure they'll be made available other ways for you to follow up with us. So thank you very much to all our panelists. Hopefully we've given you a bit of a flavour of some of the work that's been done around Flex, the opportunities for it. And with that, I'll say thank you for listening to us, and goodbye and on to the next session. Thank you.